what I'm keen to do with this session is to just have a discussion around the potential impact Brexit may have upon education more broadly. There's certainly the grammar schools debate there. There's certainly budgets there, as we've discussed earlier on today. But, are there positives? Are there some aspects that we should really look forward to exploring further that could really benefit pupils and schools alike? So we've got a great panel to discuss this. We have, of course, Caroline Wright, Director General of BESA. From TES Magazine, we have Julia Belgutay. We have Alka Sehgal Cuthbert, who is one of the founders and chairs of the Institute of Ideas think tank's Education Forum Committee. And then we have Dave Perks, who's the head of the East London Science School. So I'm really keen to just kind of open it up to you for initial thoughts. And Dave, perhaps if I could start with you and then I could work down this way. So, Dave, in your view, what's next for education post-Brexit?
Confusion. But I think there are some things that you can guarantee. I think a lot of it centres around the fact that since the coalition government, the agenda has changed quite dramatically. And there's some things that are going to remain and some things that are probably definitely up for grabs. I think you mentioned it already. So the idea of selection grammar schools is now a ferment and has been unleashed, partly because there's no electoral damage to be done if you're an unelected Prime Minister with a coterie of advisors who've never really seen the light of day in public before. You can get away with it, and so they're getting away with it. You've also got people suggesting that the way things were done before was not right, i.e. The attempt to change what was, if you like, Michael Gove's original ideas from the coalition and try and make it different for whatever reason other than because it's not Michael Gove. And I think there's some of that going on. Nicky Morgan may have gone, but she chipped in very recently saying that UTCs should be allowed to recruit from age 11, i.e. let's really reinvent tripartite education. And you can just see that this is quite a bit of a caricature, really, in some senses. But unfortunately, I do believe that it will be experimented with in the real world, so we're going to have to live with it. That's one way of looking at it. However, the other thing, if you go back to Michael Gove's agenda, is what he did do, which I think will remain regardless, is he put the idea of making schools address the idea of knowledge rather than just teaching skills, and we can sort of discuss that a bit if you wish, back on the agenda, and opened up the idea that the curriculum really, really matters. And that's not gone away, and I don't think it will either, because the whole point is at the moment is if you bring in grammar schools, it's because they can deliver an academic curriculum, but is it for all people or is it only suitable for some? And I think the retrenchment away from Gove's agenda is to say that actually it's only suitable for some. Personally, I think that's wrong, very wrong, and I think actually most people involved in education, whether it be actually even in the Tory party or in the DFE, have committed themselves since the coalition came into office to actually trying an educational reform experiment that is about giving more young people the chance to get a rigorous education. And it's a strange thing, but even the officials in the DFE who've worked on free schools, I've met personally, but also seen them in operation, it's reinvigorated them. It's given them a lease of life they've never had before and a purpose. And as they would see it, I'm sure, with a small m, a moral purpose in terms of what they're doing about education. And I think that's not going to go away. Cameron committed to another 500 free schools. No one's saying they're not going to do it. They're just saying that they want to look at grammar schools on top of that. So it's a bit of a mess, but also it's something which is an opportunity for people who do want to try and open up the ground to teaching young people a rigorous academic education, which is what I'm trying to do. The space is still there. It's not gone. And that is a godsend compared to where we were before the coalition with the last Labour government, which had kind of written a model and that was it. There was nowhere else to go. So there is still room to manoeuvre, and that creates opportunities. Just a couple of tiny little bits, if I may. I can't help but mention technology in education, I'm sorry. Okay, so I think what I'm interested in is what we teach, but I'm afraid that most people are still interested in how we teach, and most people are looking for the tricks, looking for the easy answers, looking for the fix, the quick get out of jail card, whatever it is that will suddenly solve the problem. Sorry to say, there aren't any. Teaching is hard work, get used to it. But it's really good fun and rewarding if you do take it seriously. And I think that is a message that's got to come out somehow over the next few years if we're to avoid a few disasters on the way. And I'm afraid that the rush to technology has sometimes tripped us up in education. There's an idea out there, it's been out there for quite a while, an idea out there that it's going to solve things. I would suggest that currently it's big data that's the kind of backbone of that. And it's been pushed by a fair few people. And the idea is that if you've got big data, you don't need teachers, because big data will tell you how to teach. You don't need to know pedagogically, you just ask big data for what works the best and use that. That one, I fear, is a real red herring and a dangerous one, and so I'd watch that one if it's going to develop. I could throw in a few more things, but I won't. I actually really like technology, by the way, and we love to teach it, rather than thinking that using it will solve the problem.
Thanks, Dave. Be assured we will go out to the floor and take questions in a little while, but if I could now move on to Alka.
Thank you. Well, I think it is an opportunity for a bit of a shake-up, and I think there's no harm in looking back and having a bit of a historical overview. But I do think the choice of grammar schools is like a real missed opportunity, a real missed trick, and a completely one that is not actually addresses the problem. I would say that in Britain, the unique selling point, if you like, of Britain's education system, which has been admired world over, is the fact that Britain has historically developed a liberal education system. And that liberal education system has been underpinned by a really strong commitment to knowledge, to academic knowledge that Dave mentioned just then. Or, if you look back through the historical development and policy documents of the government during the early part of the 20th century, in the run-up to the 1944 Butler Act, that was those kinds of conversations, very serious conversations about the curriculum, what kind of knowledge, how to train the teachers, how best it would be taught, how best it could be assessed, all those kinds of things were going on. That is a real problem today, because we want knowledge. A lot of people want knowledge. Dave wants knowledge, I want knowledge, Gove wanted knowledge, other people want knowledge, but there's quite a lot of disagreement about what knowledge actually is. And I think two quick examples just to illustrate the main problems that I think, broader kind of cultural problems that I think anyone interested in education has to kind of think about. I don't know if you heard Radio 4 this morning. So they're talking about, there's an international report out, Britain's doing very poorly, blah, blah, blah in maths, we need to boost up the maths teaching. And then, but when asked, when sort of probed a bit more by John Humphreys, we're told by one person that we need to boost maths teaching because, it has been proven that, a good ability with numbers is going to get you a good job, better wages, and improve your health. And that was just asserted and accepted, no questioning there. And you're thinking, couldn't quite see how that really, that needs a bit more explanation at the very least. And then on the other hand, we're told that people in Britain have a very poor ability with numbers. Apparently, we've only got the level 2 or something, most adults, and yet at the same time we all use maths a lot more than we actually know in our everyday lives. So either we're using maths and have a certain level of competence in it, or we're kind of really dumb, at the level of 2 or 5-year-olds. So couldn't quite make up their mind about that. And that kind of shows you one form of, if you like, an instrumental justification that mathematics is only good for you, in as much as you can work out what kind of discount you're getting when you get a pair of trainers, or it will help you when you do your shopping, which is actually, most people have kind of got along with doing those things fairly well. Neither of them could actually say, well, we need to teach maths because maths is a great subject, right? It's a form of knowledge about the world, a particular aspect of the world. It's a discipline that's been developed since Plato's time. It talks about all kinds of wonderful things. No one could say that. No one thought to say that. Instead, it was all this very economic kind of justification. So that's one form of major instrumentalism. That's quite a long-standing one. That form of instrumentalism has been around since the 1970s. Quick move on to another form of instrumentalism. Yesterday I was at a seminar in Cambridge, a room full of about 70 people, a mixture of academics and students. The session was called Decolonising Education. I made a point, which I thought, no, actually I won't be disingenuous, I knew it would cause a bit of a stir, and it did. I said I didn't think that ideas had a colour. I said, how can ideas have a colour or a gender or a race? People do, sure, and people choose this idea over that idea, and they might choose to use one idea to justify what they do, and that can be wrong or boring or very good or whatever. You can argue that out. But ideas themselves do not have a colour. They're abstract. That's the point of them. Academic knowledge is disciplinary knowledge. It's been abstracted from the context. Scholars throughout classical, medieval, Renaissance, Enlightenment times have worked on that knowledge to make it abstract so that it can be generalisable, so that school knowledge can be derived from it. Okay, school knowledge has other influences as well, but essentially that has to be there if you're going to have the kind of knowledge that underpins a liberal education. So when I said this thing, not ideas don't have a colour, there was an absolute uproar. Absolute uproar. It was like I was killing somebody's grandmother in front of them or something. So that tells you the political instrumentalism is there. And I think unless we can kind of, first of all, recognise it when we see it, B, think about ways of countering it, and finding out how to put forward a positive case for knowledge, then I think we're going to have problems in delivering what I think we would all agree is we'd want the next generation to have an education that was intellectually rigorous and emancipatory.
Thank you, Alka. Caroline.
Thank you. Well, I suppose what's next for education post-Brexit? For the majority of education, at least 0 to 19, you could say, well, nothing for the next 2 years until you actually leave Europe. The funding for schools comes from government. Actually, there's no change. We're not governed by Europe when it comes to how we teach in our schools. But actually, the impact on the ground has been very different. We carry out a quarterly barometer report of market trends, both from industry and teachers and schools, and they tell us, what's being spent in schools. And actually, schools, and David might have a view on this, tend, from what we see, be the most conservative. Anytime there's kind of an economic twitch, the general election is the same. Elections, any kind of events, schools really batten down the hatches and don't spend, which is, you think, well, why? Actually, they're most secure in the money's going to come from government. It has to come from government. But we've seen a consistent downturn from sort of the general election and then again post-Brexit. So actually, in real impact, there has been a considerable impact on schools and the amount they're spending. I suppose if you look at what will the impact of leaving Europe have on schools, it might actually make life a little bit easier in terms of procurement. It's an EU competency, so we will have to find out how much government decides to keep of the existing EU regulations on procurement, and you have certain thresholds over which schools have to advertise in the European Journal and so on. We don't know yet what's that going to look like in 2 years' time. It would be lovely if it was actually simplified for industry and schools, because a lot of time is spent on that, but that's probably too much to hope for. But that's kind of one area. The other area is larger impact on the university space when you think about our research funding. A huge amount of that comes from Europe, and I'm already hearing academics really worried about actually their research proposals and the way they work very collaboratively in cross-European projects. Another angle of that is we will have to wait and see whether, and I think we should be okay with this, because I think our universities and our school system, our private schools, have as much of a reputation that we will still keep attracting the high net worth individuals from around the world into our private schools and universities. But that's kind of very practical potential impact over the next 2 years. In terms of policy making, I was thinking about this, and I think my thinking's already been proved wrong. But it would be nice if you think actually government is having to find so many civil servants to go and negotiate new trade agreements for us around the world, a couple of hundred different free trade agreements. It would be nice if that actually meant that the rest of the civil service was just a bit quiet and there weren't too many new policies, and actually schools could just get on with dealing with the changes that have actually come about over the last few years. But that was proved wrong, really, with grammar schools. So I got, we live in hope, but that could be a potential. In terms of kind of education industry, we heard earlier on today from Steve at Data Harvest about inflation and the inflationary pressures. You've got the yin and the yang of actually it's probably cheaper for other countries to buy our products, but they're probably going to go up because we're importing a number of the raw materials and so on to go in them. But in terms of opportunities, I have to say I've been in 3 or 4 different countries with education companies since the Brexit vote, and I'm really encouraged just by the fact that our reputation for British education resources and the British education system isn't linked to Europe. We do it in our own right. So actually quite a number of countries are quite excited about the opportunity of doing more with us. And I think it's an opportunity for us actually in building stronger, more direct relationships from that side. So probably 50-50 from me.
Thanks, Caroline. And Julia.
As an education specialist reporter who's also a German living in Scotland, obviously it's been politically an interesting summer, to say the least. And as Caroline already said, there's a lot of stuff at this point that we don't know. We don't know what impact it will have on the 150,000 college and university students that are in the UK at the moment. We don't know what impact it will have. We know, for example, that every 6th new teacher last year was a European citizen, most of them from Spain. And simply we don't know what the impact on them will be. We also don't quite practically know what the impact on schools will be. We don't know what the impact will be in terms of other funding that colleges, for example, receive. I know Scottish colleges by themselves get about 20 million in EU funding at the moment directly from Europe. We don't know how that will change or how that will be affected. What we do know is that there's a definite change in perception already. There's a feeling on the ground that something is sort of changing. And that's not just among Europeans, that's among British Europeans as much as anyone else. And I think that's where the grammar school debate comes into it as well, that there's a perception that the discourse is slightly changing. You're moving sort of into another era. And I was speaking to our editor about that this morning, who will do a speech about that tomorrow, about this sort of idea that it's very easy to have the moral high ground at the moment on sort of both sides. And that's the same on grammar schools. You have 2 very extreme views that don't seem to be compatible in any way, but they will need to be eventually. They will need to get on at some point. And I think there's a lot to be gained from trying to see the other side, both on Brexit and on the grammar school debate. We do also know that schools will have to do a lot more on trying to reconcile this idea of Brexit, both in terms of the kind of cultural outlook that they have and will need to maintain. I got a press release yesterday, I get quite a lot of those, of course, and it had the top 10 fears people have of Brexit. I don't know who they asked, but apparently it's that we can't get champagne anymore was the top fear. And then number 2 was Swiss and Dutch cheeses would run out. That's apparently a danger. And then number 3 was that languages would no longer be taught in British schools. And like I said, I have no idea who these people asked, but I don't think that's a realistic fear, and I think a lot will need to be done to kind of separate completely unrealistic fears from things that we will actually need to keep an eye on. I've met with a group of German primary school children in Scotland last week, and there were quite a few who have said they've started saying that they're British because they're worried about what people might say. And there's something that schools will need to do about that fear that is there, justifiably or not, among these children. So a lot of this will develop over time, but I think a lot of that we will also need to keep an eye on. But I do think there are opportunities in this, because people are clearly not happy with the status quo, both in terms of education, which is why we're looking at grammar schools again, and in terms of the kind of political landscape. So I think there's always an opportunity in change.
Thanks, Julia. Now, I've got lots of questions, but I'm actually really keen to go out and take some points from or questions from the floor.
Firstly, I don't know what Brexit means, neither does anyone else, so just to put that in there, we don't know what Brexit means. We know it's a divorce, we don't know what happens after the divorce. That's point. I think it's really important to understand, irrespective of what Brexit means, if the UK is going to stand on its own, the education has to be globally focused. It has to be as to how we make ourselves better. It would be really good to know that we're going to be the masters of nanotechnology, or we're going to do artificial intelligence, so that we can direct our education accordingly. There was a point made earlier about the intellectual aspect of education, and I'm not going to be controversial, but I think employability needs to be at the heart of education. There's a reason that we need to stand up our own. We need to make sure there's employability, and I don't think we've really spoken about employability driving some of the education. If it did drive it much better in the past, we wouldn't have the skills gaps we have in the country. So the employability aspect is never discussed. Maybe it's a bit too dirty for everyone to talk about, but unless you get the employability agenda correct, we end up with children, young adults being taught subjects which employers frankly can't convert into economic output.
I'd just like to ask the panel, what probability would they assign to sort of the fears that obviously the government may move in one direction regarding immigration, and it's already been touched upon that sort of our higher education industry is very much well supplied by international money and international students. What probability would you assign to it being likely that the powers that be would almost kill the geese that lays the golden egg in this regard?
So, well, perhaps if I start with Julia, and then we'll feel free to respond to those, and also any of the other points that you'd like to pick up from other panellists.
I mean, in terms of further higher education, that depends on what you mean by that. I think we can't forget the kind of importance of perception in this. There were stories, and they were reported internationally a couple of weeks ago, of people being asked to step back from reports, scientists not being able to be involved because of where they were coming from and their political background. People notice that sort of thing. And the question is, do you actively stop people from coming in, or are people maybe just slightly more likely to think about whether they want to come in? They're two kind of entirely different things for me. I think it's highly unlikely we're going to actively stop students from wanting to come here. It might be slightly harder, it might be more expensive. I think both of those things are likely to happen. I don't think we're going to actively try and stop them. Will they want to come? I was a student coming from Germany studying in Scotland for free because I was a European citizen. Would I do the same for £36,000? Unlikely. I'm a journalist after all, I'm not going to earn that by 2050 probably. But I think perception is going to be a really big issue in this, really for both questions. On employability, I think what we always hear from education institutions is how difficult that is to predict. How do you know what is going to be needed for the jobs of tomorrow? And that I think is a challenge there.
Dave, and then Caroline.
The employability one is, I think, a red herring, I'm afraid. I think you can never use schools to create employable people. What you can do with schools is teach them enough so they know enough, so then when they're put in that position of wanting to find a career, then they're tooled up with what we can give them, which is what schools are able to do. But if you think schools can do vocational education well, I think you're deluded. It's not worked, it's never worked, and it's the wrong thing to ask a school to do. So I think it's not about employment.
I wasn't saying schools, I was saying education as a whole.
Okay, but I'm talking about schools, so you can.
Schools, I agree.
Right, fine. I mean, but then we might throw in the thing about UTCs. I also think UTCs are a red herring as well, because a UTC is trying to say that there are some children who would be better off in a vocational route. But a good vocational route is tough. That's, I don't think, the answer. So what you really want is extremely good technical education. For me, that's post-16. You offer it. We do it really well. We used to do it very well. My father did it at night school, converted from a cabinet maker to an engineer, etc. We've killed that off. Right? Other countries haven't to the same extent. So I'm not arguing that you don't need technical education. I'm arguing you need really good technical education, but I would say post-16, and that's something we're pushing at in our own way. I think the immigration thing is just sort of fear. It's about fear of the unknown, fear of what's going to happen. I don't think anybody's going to turn around and say that immigrants all have to leave the country. That's just a ludicrous idea. And people are saying that for a purpose. They want to stoke up a kind of opposition. And I also think that sort of the idea that xenophobia is on the rise and out of control and that everything's changed all of a sudden is wrong as well. It's just the fact that the people who voted to remain in the EU lost, and they don't really understand why, and they're frustrated by it. And unfortunately, they're not dealing with where we're going and just backing off from that. And I think the sooner we deal with where we are and where we're going, that will calm down and we'll be able to cope with it. One thing I would say is that we need as schools to defend things like modern foreign languages, to defend subjects which are under attack. I mean, some of the exam boards are getting rid of some of these exams. It's ludicrous that exam boards can then dictate what subjects are right or wrong to study. Things like that you can definitely have an argument about.
Caroline.
Thank you. I think on employability, you definitely need knowledge, but you also need skills. I don't actually care what university degree someone studied as long as they can do the job. And I think that was really struck me when I used to be in the civil service. And I remember kind of first coming across, there are this group of civil servants called the fast streamers. So they're really, really clever. They've got lots and lots of knowledge, but quite often they haven't got any common sense whatsoever. So actually they can draft perfect policy, but actually with very little knowledge of what real life people are going through or some of the impacts it might have. So I think you always need a mix. Obviously, if you're doing very specific jobs, you need the skills to have to do a specific job. But if you're generally doing a job where you need to write, to think and communicate with people, it's a mixture of knowledge and skills. For me, that's my own view of it. In terms of I don't know what the probability is of actually quotas and immigration and people being allowed in or out, but what I do hope is in the whole the Department for Exiting of the EU, I hope there's a team there doing some cross-government work actually looking at what we need both and working towards developing the skills in the UK as well for the future. We obviously have a big skills and shortage in a whole range of areas, and we need to have a longer term plan to gradually bridge the gap by obviously needing people from other countries carrying out those kinds of roles, but also in building our own capacity and capability to do that. And we have a perfect example of where it hasn't worked in the past in when you look at the powers between local authorities in education being taken away gradually and diminished with the rise of sort of academies and other kind of regional structures. It came as a bit of news to the government a few years ago when the teams within the local authorities that used to do place planning, school place planning, in very many parts of the country, they had sort of gone. They were one of the first teams to go through cutbacks, and it was only when they realised, I think it was they needed 500,000 more primary school places for the children in 18 months' time that they got busy with some porter cabins. But you kind of hope that actually that mistake won't be made because by now they'll be just about starting secondary schools and so on. So I think it's that cross-government and regional thinking that needs to go on actually to do some planning, and I think if we do that, whatever outcome we get to, at least if we plan for it, it'll be helpful.
Alka?
Yes, I'm really puzzled that anyone could think that employability is never discussed. It seems to me it's the only way education is discussed these days, and I think it's deeply problematic. I mean, over 100 years ago, the father of sociology, Emil Durkheim, said the point of education is to create citizens for a specific destination in society, your employability or a job, but also it was to, and in fact more importantly, he argued it was to produce citizens who could think and participate in civic life. And it seems to me, what you want to ask yourself is whether we as a society, whether you're an employer or a teacher or an adult, want the next generation to be able to do that. If they can do that, then they'll be able to fit into any kind of specific job or apprenticeship or vocational thing that they choose to go into, providing, of course, that they're there. And it seems to me that that's the problem that you were alluding to, that they're not there. The apprenticeships, of vocational courses, the technical training colleges, which, by the way, were called technical training colleges, but nearly every technical course also had a core liberal educational intellectual component there, because being intellectual doesn't mean you faff around going, oh, aren't I wonderful, sort of smelling your own farts. Being intellectual just means that you can think, you're able to hold an idea in your head and compare it to other ideas and get a sense of what's important and a sense of perspective. But what job doesn't need that? What job couldn't benefit from that, whether you're, you know, a mum or a nuclear scientist? It seems to me you could benefit from that. So anyway, that's my thing on, and it comes back to the whole thing of, you know, the knowledge is the key. It's the thing to be looking at. On the immigration and academics, immediately after Brexit, I'm doing my doctoral thesis at Cambridge. We and my other friends I know at other universities had immediate emails from our Vice-Chancellor saying all funding was secured. The Erasmus project was going ahead. In fact, the problem with Erasmus had been that people weren't applying for it because the bureaucratic form filling was so onerous. As far as I know, I've not yet heard of anyone kind of any collapsing through lack of funding or, you know, promised funding in the future for projects that are already underway. Cambridge has a very flourishing high-tech sector. Microsoft and all various other companies are all based there. They've done very well in terms of doing all the breakthrough things, and which I'm afraid I'm not a scientist, I can't, but all kinds of technological things. Dave, you might know about some of the things they've invented. The main problem for them is the fact that the next stage, that whole layer of investment, where the kind of blue skies breakthroughs in academia can then be worked through and developed and generalised more broadly, that's lacking. Okay, and that's not a problem for schools, that's a problem of, you know, economic policy and politics. Right, that's not a problem of education. The problem for education is what's the best knowledge, how do we make sure the teachers know what the best knowledge is, and how do we make sure our teachers are free to teach it?
I just want to pick up on one thing that Julia talked about, because Julia, you talked about the experience of some pupils in a classroom in Scotland who are now starting to define themselves as British as a result of the votes. And actually, I was struck that TES, as a company, came out in favour of Remain beforehand, on the back of a survey of teachers. I think 7 out of 10 said that they supported Remain, which is actually much higher, obviously, than the general public. So I mean, have you had any? What's the kind of mood on the ground since? I guess is my question. I mean, certainly there must be kind of a bit of a bleak feel in a lot of classrooms around the country after the votes. Do you think they've now reconciled themselves to that vote, and how do you think they're explaining it to their pupils?
I think explaining it is difficult. The political landscape at the moment must be, I wouldn't want to be a teacher and have to explain what's going on in the world to young people at this point. I'm quite glad I just have to report about it, to be honest. I think there was a lot of disbelief. I think there's now a lot of uncertainty. Not because budgets are necessarily at risk, and people say this, you know, I've heard that argument made quite a lot of the time recently. Nothing has really gone wrong yet. The world hasn't collapsed yet. No one has run out of money. None of that has happened, but that's because Britain isn't out yet. None of this has actually really started. And I think that uncertainty is something that schools are feeling as well, and teachers are feeling just like every other human being. So I think there's a lot of that. I think children are struggling with understanding the political world at the moment, and Brexit will be one layer of that. I think they won't necessarily be able to distinguish it from other political issues that are going on around, you know, sort of political discourse and things that are happening in other countries, particularly around Europe at the same time, the refugee crisis being one of those issues. And I think, you know, TES is certainly trying very hard to kind of share good practice amongst teachers and try and make sure everyone stays informed. We have had teachers coming to us saying there have been rises in sort of certainly abuse against European children in classrooms. Colleagues of mine have done stories about the rise of that. But I think that's, again, part of the political discourse.
Mm-hmm. Dave?
I find this really hard. I mean, if you react to children and say, oh my God, it's awful, then what do you expect them to say back? I mean, they're going to say, oh my God, it's awful, back to you. I think we've got to sort of be a bit more careful about how we do this. I mean, if we think that the world's gone mad and we've lost sense of what we're doing, then we can't explain anything to anybody. So I think teachers in that respect are probably the worst people to expect to explain this, because most of them voted the way that lost, and they think it's a disaster. I was at Head Teachers Conference in Cambridge, as it happens, which dealt with teachers from a really wide range across the country. To a single person, other than me and another friend, they all thought this was absolutely outrageous and were making jokes about it and how the whole place is run by racists and all the rest of it. And if that's the way you talk about it, what about the children who actually were in families who did vote leave? What are you saying to them? And therefore, it's no surprise there's confusion and difficulty in talking about this, because we don't know how to. I think you can. And actually, if you listen to children debate about it properly and openly, they've got as much sense as anybody else. And teachers would do well to listen as well as trying to tell people. And I think that's a message that is maybe hard, but maybe that we need to get across. There is not a right answer in this. There is only what is, and we're working it out.
But I don't think that anyone is suggesting, and certainly Tess has never suggested, that teachers are going in and saying it's all a disaster and saying that to children.
I'm sorry, but I'm seeing it. I witnessed it with, I said again, a conference of head teachers from across the North East region. Regional Schools Commissioner was there with Michael Barber, who promoted the same argument to them unashamedly.
Isn't it?
Yeah, but that's your head teachers. If they're doing that, what do you expect the teachers to do, and what do you expect the children to do back? It's like we're saying, if you were on that side, you're not right. You're the wrong kind of child. And we have to be really careful if that's what we're saying. And I think that is a real problem that exists. And I think that actually, as I said, we do well to listen to children as much as anybody else, and to think that actually there is another side in the argument, and it's not just kind of crazy people who shouldn't have the right to vote.
Keen to bring Caroline Knack back in, but can I see if there's any hands or any points from the audience at this point? I thought there might be a couple in here.
When these big changes happen, everybody thinks, oh my God, it's all going to go horribly wrong. So I'd like to ask the panel, if you were thinking about what could go right, and if you had the ability to rewrite a manifesto from education up rather than from politics down, what would your view of right be?
I've spent the last 6 months going and meeting with quite a few different schools, careers officers, and talking about how they're helping their children into university and into careers. And I've noticed a huge disparity in the advice that they're giving to their students. So we've heard from the panel that it's the job of schools to prepare children with a base level of education, but not necessarily specific to a career path. Is it at least the job of schools to be able to help their students to absorb and help them make decisions about their own career path and where they might take their schooling and apply those skills in their career?
Obviously, no one's got a crystal ball, so we don't fully know the picture of the vote. And as quite rightly mentioned, we haven't actually conducted Brexit yet. It is coming. And also, as mentioned, of like 7 out of 10 teachers voted Remain. But obviously, there is a portion there that voted to leave. And without anyone giving any away their kind of political leanings, is there any suggestion what the positivity, what the view was of how this is actually going to encourage education as a whole, as an ed tech as ourselves? What did people actually glean as the potential benefits? It's with any kind of change, there's always going to be pessimism and doom and gloom. It's fear of the unknown. But I also think in certain areas there's always positivity about. And even if it's the case of, well, this is going to be our future, so we've got to make the best of it. But I tend to think as well that people had a good reason for voting, the way that they did. So again, that's probably for the floor, but also for the for the table.
I think I will start with Dave and then work down to Julia to end. So Dave.
Okay, I'll do the careers thing first, because I've made a big thing about that's not the role of schools in terms of what their core purpose is. But actually, I think you can do a darn sight better than people are doing. And careers education in schools has been a disaster for years and years and years. You go and see the Connections Guide to find out the boring, obvious, you could be a dustman if you wanted to. Who cares? I mean, it's patronising in the extreme. I exaggerate, I'm afraid. And it was shut down, and rightly so, because it was awful. It did nothing to help anybody. So, I mean, the best careers advice I can give young people in my school is work really, really hard at school, get to university, and work out what you're doing when you've got the best degree you can get. What else could you say, really? If they choose not to, though, at 16, then what we're trying to do is try and guide them out the door, not throw them out the door. So we're trying to find a way of saying, you've got this step, you can do this, you can do this, you can go there, you can do this. Here's some employers, and bring them into the school. So I think we're actually in a position to do a really good job because we're strong at our core in what we do educationally. And hopefully that'll be a model that other people can copy. So I do think you can do something, but it's not the core purpose. If you get confused, then you won't do either. What's positive about leave? Freedom. It's as simple as that. And so if you want to say to people why they voted leave, it's because they get rid of the bureaucrats they don't know telling them what to do and telling them how they should live their lives. And that's scary, yes, because then you let go of the umbilical cord, whether that's your research grants, if you're a scientist or whatever it is, and you have to stand on your own 2 feet. But that's the moment that the opportunity arises. You don't know what it is, but if you've got the guts to go for it, you'll find something. And I think that's the simplest way to explain it, and probably the way I'd write a manifesto if I was going to do it in terms of education. The opportunities are huge. You just got to get them. Don't think you're being given it, go out and make it. That's it.
Thank you, Dave. Alka.
Yeah, I think Dave's more or less covered anything I'd want to say on the careers advice, so I won't go over that. Positivity, absolutely. I don't mind giving my position where I voted to leave, and I voted to leave for freedom because it just seemed the absolute right thing to do. I spent a year looking at education policies from the 50s to the current day, and I saw the transition, in the language you could see the transition between very lucid, clear, rational arguments to the kind of jargon and incomprehensible gobbledygook as increasingly a kind of national bodies and a wide range of people from trade unions, teachers, parents, vicars, scouts and what have you, who would be invited to talk about education policy, diminished, got smaller and smaller, and instead you'd have these sort of acronyms of groups that nobody knew who they were, where they belonged to, where they'd come from, who voted for them, but they were all funded and established through either the EU or through United Nations or the OECD or some international kind of body. And it seemed to me that this was a very kind of indicative of a trend towards, trying to surpass or bypass national accountability in the name of a kind of scientific, value-neutral, international rubric, as if numbers by themselves could tell you anything. So for that reason, I'm very glad, and I think in academia for sure, the fact that 90% of the academics voted to leave has caused voted to stay. Has really shaken academia up, and I think if some questions come out of that, if a bit of reflective self-questioning and, well, what are we doing? What happened here? How come, we're meant to serve the public, yet we're so out of kilter with the public? If those kinds of questions can be discussed in academia, which, there are signs it might be happening, and there could certainly be a lot more of it, that will be a good thing. The Bologna process, hideous thing. The less, it's all right, one thing to have funding, collaborative international funding. It's another thing to have a group of people who meet like the kind of people that vote for the Pope in the Vatican. Nobody knows who they are on this seat. They have incredibly complex documents and meetings to discuss how they're going to check the way that they check something else, layers and layers of kind of procedural stuff. And it all seems very, very removed. But then when you're a teacher at East London Science School, or when I was teaching in North London, at the beginning of September, something comes through on your desk saying, you've got to start teaching children about obesity awareness or how to, have sex in a nice way. That would be nice, wouldn't it? So, you know, so this, and you think, where has this come from? It's come from Bologna. Yeah, it's come from those kinds of discussions, and it's deeply, deeply problematic. And the sooner we can get rid of that, the better. Or, you know, really good riddance to that.
Caroline.
No, I'm not buying into the bureaucracy. Education is a nationally devolved responsibility. So actually, anything that teachers don't like is a direct result of our own government telling them something they don't want to do. So I think bureaucracy will come from anywhere, whether it's Europe or somewhere else. Sadly, I don't think there'll be a day where we're not filling out forms. You know, that would be lovely, but I don't think it's going to happen. The positivity for me about leaving Europe is the fact that actually, if we're going to leave Europe, our government, who's making it happen, has to make it a success. So they absolutely have to make sure that our exporters in this room, our companies, can find markets and do have the support. So I'm looking at it positively from the fact that we used to have our export promoters as a tiny section of the Department for Business. Now there's actually 3 departments covering trade. You've got the department, well, you've got the Foreign Office, you've got the Department for International Trade, so an entire department dedicated to it, and an element of the free trade policy setting in the Department for Exiting Europe. So that can only be a good thing, and I'm going to kind of push to make sure that actually our education exporters get a good bite at the cherry there. What would I do? I think careers is a core role of schools, actually, for all too many children who only have kind of maybe a single parent, only one person in work. They might not find out about all the different opportunities that are out there. So actually, I think schools have got an important role in being able to show them the breadth of careers that are available. I didn't know very much about what could be open to me when I was at school, and I think there are lots and lots of children that might not even ever get the chance of trying things because nobody even tells them about it. So I think that is a core role for schools. And in terms of what would I do, well, I'm not an educationalist by background, but I would make sure that modern foreign languages were very much on the curriculum everywhere, and I'd also ring-fence money on CPD, because actually I see so many of our companies say that actually teachers don't understand how to use something, or they haven't got training in something, they batten down the hatch and they don't use it. So I'd say actually a proportion of all the money that goes into schools, there might already be a percentage, I just don't know, but I'd make sure that it continued to be a percentage or was added in a percentage for their CPD.
Thanks, Caroline. Julia.
On the careers advice point, we've done quite a lot of work on that quite recently, and I don't know whether anyone would argue that schools couldn't do more, but I don't think schools can be asked to do it all. Schools have plenty on their plate as is. Work experience, I think, is crucial. Students will tell you that any exposure to employers, anything that gets them into the workplace, gets them to see it, is incredibly helpful. It also takes a bit of pressure off teachers. No teacher will know everything about every career there is. That's just simply not possible. I also think there's a definite issue with this idea of who should and shouldn't go to university and what that should mean. It's quite easy to only ever talk about that as the ideal route. And actually, I think if I had anything to do with the manifesto, that would also be a point that I think there just isn't enough focus on the alternatives that there are to that. And I think that does something to the young people that don't go to university and the young people that choose another more vocational route. I'm a college specialist. I do a lot of my reporting on colleges, and that's certainly something that NUS will tell you and student groups will tell you that that's a big problem. In terms of what are the positives, I think there are always opportunities in change. And if this summer means anything, then it means that we have to have a rethink and a good look at what we're doing and what we could do better. And that's always a good thing.
Thank you very much, Julia. Lots to discuss over wine. So if we could thank our panellists, so that was a really interesting discussion.